Good morning. We have some folks that are still waiting to get through security and get their coats checked, but we want to stay as close to schedule as possible, so I'm going to kick this off. I'm Tim Penny. I'm a former congressman from southern Minnesota, and along with Mark Kennedy and Bill Frenzel, I co-chair the Economic Club of Minnesota, which is now in its 6th year and going great guns as we bring premier speakers to a Minnesota audience on a regular basis to address issues of national and international importance, especially as it relates to our economy and our trade relationships. We are here today to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the North American Free Trade Agreement, and a little later in the day, after a program in which we discuss all that has grown out of that agreement in the last 2 decades, we will honor and recognize Bill Frenzel, who was a ranking Republican on the Ways and Means Committee at the time that this legislation was approved by Congress, and Bill continues to this day to be heavily involved in international relations through his work at Brookings and other activities. I was in my final term, 12 years on Capitol Hill, when we addressed the Free Trade Agreement. And I was among those Democrats who were part of the WHIP organization to whip up votes for the Free Trade Agreement. And as Mack McLarty can explain, because we had many, many meetings with he and others at the White House, it was a hard slog. But we got the votes put together in a bipartisan fashion, demonstrating that good things can result when both sides are willing to work together, and it's a vote to this day that I've been very proud to have cast. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mark Kennedy to provide additional introductions and welcomes, and then we have some guests, dignitaries who are going to come forward to offer some words of greeting.
Thank you, Tim. Thanks, everybody, for being here. It is great to have our first Economic Club of Minnesota event here in Washington. We've talked about this because there are many Minnesotans in influential positions throughout the city, and this is a wonderful opportunity for us to connect with them. For those of you that don't know the Economic Club of Minnesota, we were founded, as Tim said, 6 years ago, and we're focused on engaging the world and strengthening Minnesota, and we think Minnesota is actually stronger if it does engage the world. For those not familiar with Minnesota, Minnesota is a land where few are called and many are frozen.
And can I interject that while we are experiencing 20-degree temperatures here in Washington, Mark and I escaped 20 below temperatures in Minnesota to be here.
It warms the heart of, I know Mack, who used to be at ARCLA, to have that natural gas being well utilized to keep everybody warm. But the NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, was a fundamental, significant accomplishment that took a lot of people to get done. Today we are at a crossroads. We have the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. We've got Trade Promotion Authority, all that needs to get done. And so I think there is not only great lessons to be learned from looking back at the past, but also applying those to the future, and that is our goal of our panel here today. So we're very pleased to have everyone with us. We got a great lineup that we'll be introducing here shortly, but let me turn it back over to Tim, who's going to introduce one of our co-sponsors.
And one of our co-sponsors is the Brookings Institute. And to bring words of welcome, I'd like to introduce Ted Geyer. He's the Vice President and Director of Economic Studies at Brookings. And Bill Frenzel claims that Ted is his boss. I'm not sure it works that way, but we are delighted to have you with us this morning, Mr. Geyer. Thank you for doing this.
I can clear the air. I am most definitely not the boss, but I am honored to be a colleague of Bill's. So first, let me start by saying good morning and thank you, everybody, for coming. Brookings is really pleased to co-sponsor this event marking the 20th anniversary of NAFTA. As I'm sure we'll talk about for the rest of the day, it was a great deal of controversy surrounding the debate over NAFTA 20 years ago, and then it did not cause the huge job losses feared by its critics. Instead, it did result in economic gains. Since NAFTA took effect, trade among the 3 countries has more than tripled, with a total value of over $1 trillion. Canada and Mexico now account for about 1/3 of all U.S. imports, and the North American market for advanced goods has become highly integrated. Perhaps the real legacy of NAFTA is the role it served as a model for the new generation of free trade agreements that the U.S. later negotiated. My hope is that it can also serve as an inspiration toward greater links with Asia and Europe through the current negotiations of the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, something I'm sure will come up frequently today. Clearly, trade is a controversial issue in trade negotiations. A lot of people here probably have the wounds to share. It encounters quite a bit of political turbulence, occasionally accompanied by some hyperbolic claims of doom. At Brookings, I like to think one of our roles is to provide dispassionate, independent analysis to diffuse some of that political charge from the debate. And that actually brings me to my colleague, Bill Frenzel, who, as was mentioned, will be honored later today with a Champion of Free Trade Award. Bill really embodies the best of Brookings in his commitment to measured, informed, and civil debate of key economic policies. Any of you who know Bill also on a personal note, he's just a terrific colleague. It's nice of him to call me his boss, but really I would just be happy if he called me a colleague. He's very gracious. He's a delightful guy to have around the halls, always willing to chip in, and a great sense of humor. So it's just an honor for me to be here just to represent Brookings as he receives this award. A little bit about Bill. He's been at Brookings for over 20 years following his illustrious career in Congress. In addition to working with us, he is a busy man. He co-chairs the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. He just completed his term in the Office of Congressional Ethics. Probably have some nice stories there. And of course, he continues to be involved in the topic near and dear to his heart, which is trade, through his service on the President's Advisory Committee on Trade, a body in which he has served under both President Bush and President Obama. He represents a quality that many in this town unfortunately believe is lost, the ability to work with people on both sides of the aisle to advance the public good. And in that respect, he's an inspiration to me and all his colleagues at Brookings, and I think to the broader policy community. So I commend the Economic Club of Minnesota for granting Bill the recognition as a champion of free trade, and really for organizing such a terrific event today. The lineup of speakers is quite impressive, and I'm very pleased and honored to be a part of it. So thank you very much.
And now, NAFTA, of course, involved tying United States closer together with Canada and Mexico. So we're very pleased to have the ambassadors from both countries with us. Let me first introduce Ambassador Gary Doer, and he's a phenomenal representative for Canada here. But prior to that, he was the Premier of Manitoba, and worked very closely with U.S. governors and the U.S. government to enhance cooperation along our border on any number of issues, whether it be trade, agriculture, water production, climate change, other things. And he had 3 victories in his campaigns. In each one, he had a higher percentage. He was listed by Business Week as one of the top 20 international leaders on climate change. He had balanced budgets, decreasing taxes. Sounds like a great campaign message. He'd probably get even a higher percentage today. Please welcome Ambassador Gary Doer. We're also pleased to have Consul Jamshed Merchant from Minneapolis as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Tim, and good morning, Excellency. Our trade ambassadors that continue to provide great leadership on trade with Canada, United States, and Mexico, ongoing leadership in this regard. It's great to be here with our Consul General, Jamshed. I just want to say that to my Minnesota friends, that we regret that Amy Klobuchar, the great senator from Minnesota, in a rope towing contest across the International Falls, loaded up her team with a group of ex-Minnesota Vikings. If you want to take a look at Jamshed and compare him to the size of Carl Eller, you will know why we were greatly offended by Amy and her team. And I promise you, a number of NHL hockey players that reside at Lake of the Woods in the summer after the Stanley Cup playoffs will be on our team, and we will seek and achieve revenge for this humiliation that we received at the hands of your good senator. Speaking of hockey, I had a great relationship when I was Premier with Tim Pawlenty, and we worked together on trade knowledge, the knowledge economy, and energy and water. And I think some of those issues are all front and center on NAFTA. In Canada, trade in our neighborhood of North America is very popular. I think the polls rank it as extremely high, and for all of us who have to continue to describe NAFTA in more populist terms than just raw statistics, I think it's important to point out to our American friends, and people in Minnesota know this well, that we're your largest customer. I know people say, oh, we're good trade partners, but actually customers mean something, I think, and we have to continue to describe this relationship in more populist terms, because the results, I believe, have exceeded the perceptions, particularly here in the United States. So I think we have an ongoing opportunity to continue to build on their great success. We're going to be in Mexico in a couple of weeks. Many of you will be there as well to look at how we can move forward in the next 20 years. Certainly, I see ourselves as allies on trade, not just as opponents of each other, whether it's bilateral or trilateral. It doesn't make any sense at all to have a light vehicle emission standard in Canada, different from the United States, different from building Cadillacs in Guanajuato and Leon. It just makes sense to have the same regulatory environment, and I think we should do it on a trilateral basis. We also see an excellent opportunity at that meeting to work together on rule of law and reciprocity in TPP. There is more in our value system as democracies and our trading experience that binds us together than divides us, dealing with the new Pacific Regional Trade Agreement. I'm sure we'll hear about that at the State of the Union tonight, but we certainly think that our experience with Minnesota and our experience together should inform these discussions. We also think we've won the lottery on energy, and sometimes it's difficult to cash the ticket. But I would note that the President of Mexico has amended the Constitution over the last 12 months. We have energy efficiency with light vehicle emission standards, renewables. Canada sells a lot, and Manitoba sells a lot of renewable energy to the United States. We want to define hydroelectric as renewable, as you do in Minnesota. We think that gas is a great opportunity, and with the amended Constitution in Mexico and some of the discoveries in the Eagle Ford and the Bakken and in Canada, we certainly believe that we can have energy independence in this neighborhood. Presidents have talked about this since President Nixon, but we actually have the opportunity, I believe, to describe it in more optimistic and holistic terms at the meeting that will take place, hosted by our friends our amigos in Mexico. And lastly, I think water is going to be a very important issue. I dealt with water with Governor Pawlenty. You've got the Great Lakes in Minnesota and in Canada. You've got the Lake of the Woods system. You've got opposition to diverting water from the Missouri into Minnesota, Manitoba, North Dakota. And you have different water systems, whether it's the Columbia River system, the Flathead River system, Lake of the Woods, Great Lakes, Lake Champlain, the Passamaquoddy, the Arctic Ocean, the water systems that go into Mexico from the United States. And I think having policies that modernize our policies on water is another challenge and opportunity. Like oil, like gas, we are blessed with a lot of water. You know that in Minnesota, the land of 10,000 lakes. We always grew up believing that those lakes provided great beer for us to drink when we were in our youth. But we also know that we cannot take this resource for granted. We've got to manage it effectively and in a cooperative way, because it doesn't know the boundaries between our three countries. So that's, again, I wish you well today. I've got a call with my boss this morning, and you always take a call from your boss if you're an ambassador. When you're a premier, your boss is the whole province. When you're an ambassador, your boss is the big guy. Thank you very, very much. Merci. Gracias.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. And now, having heard from our neighbor to the north, we have words of greeting from our neighbor to the south. I'm pleased to introduce the ambassador from Mexico, He has built a distinguished career in both the public and the private sectors. Before coming to Washington, Ambassador Medina Mora was Ambassador of Mexico to the United Kingdom, and previous to that appointment, he held cabinet-level positions in the Mexican federal government. In his posts, Ambassador Medina Mora has held important responsibilities in international forums and other negotiations, including a negotiator for the Alliance for Prosperity and Security in North America, and he was a chief negotiator for the Mexico-U.S. Border Partnership Agreement back in 2002. We're delighted to have you with us this morning and call you forward now for some words of greeting.
Thank you very much. I am really delighted to be here and congratulate the Economic Club of Minnesota for organizing this event. It's only timely that we do this because we are celebrating the 20th anniversary of NAFTA. And this is a good opportunity to reflect on our shared future, particularly so, given that several of its architects are here with us today. Ambassador Hill, thank you very much, and I really, Ambassador Zoellick, really honored to share this with you. I look forward to hearing their views, which now benefit from the special hindsight that we have already 20 years behind us after the entering into force of the agreement. There is an old African saying that states that there are two ideal times to plant a tree: 20 years ago and right now. Well, a tree was planted 20 years ago. NAFTA represented a big leap forward in the strategic outlook and in the rules of governing economic interaction in our region, North America. For those of you in the audience who may be too young to remember just how forward-looking NAFTA was, we need only to recall the 1992 presidential debates in which a famous Texan, a faced independent candidate for the US presidency, Ross Perot, said NAFTA would create a giant sucking sound, as NAFTA sent US jobs to Mexico because of wage differentials between both countries. Having been there from the private sector, I have to also say that some groups in Mexico also feared that sucking sound, but the exact opposite concern, and assumed that NAFTA would translate into significant job losses in Mexico in favor of US, given the large size of many US corporations and their easy access to capital and technology. Well, there were also fears about the negotiations themselves. In the US, some argued that NAFTA negotiations would be a distraction, and that the US should concentrate then on the GATT-Uruguay round of multilateral trade negotiations. In Mexico, it was feared that our negotiators would not be able to secure effective access for our exports to the US market, ensure adequate transition times for the liberalization of sensitive sectors, or exclude foreign investment from the oil sector. Well, we did. We were really trading upon new ground. There was no precedent for such a far-reaching trade agreement between a developing country and two developed countries. It liberalized tariffs on practically all goods, including agricultural products. It included trade in services and provisions on investment, intellectual property, and government procurement. But its scope and coverage, NAFTA was, in fact, the most advanced free trade agreement in the world back then. It is safe to say that 20 years after the agreement entered into force, naysayers on both sides of the border have proven definitely wrong. Intra-NAFTA trade, $296 billion in 1993, was $1.13 trillion in 2012, just above that figure in 2013. It's now over $500 billion between Mexico and the US. Mexico is the second largest market for US export, only second to Canada. Your second largest customer, and I love the expression. And that giant sucking sound Mr. Perot thought he would hear is now the sound of Mexicans consuming U.S. and Canadian goods. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce estimates that 6 million American jobs depend on trade with Mexico. The U.S. exports more to Mexico than to the BRICS combined, to Japan and China combined, or to France, Germany, the Netherlands, and the UK taken together. Mexico is one of the top 3 export destinations for 28 different U.S. states. More importantly, we not only trade intensively with each other, we jointly produce goods through the deeply integrated production and supply chains that have the different rules established by NAFTA. The percentage of U.S. value added into U.S. imports from Japan is only 2%. From the European Union is also 2%. It is 3% for imports from Brazil, 4% from Chinese imports, and it is certainly 25% for imports from Canada. But it is 40% for imports from Mexico. This is to say that U.S. imports from Mexico have 10 times more U.S. value added than U.S. imports from China. In short, the 3 of us, Mexico, Canada, and the U.S., have benefited from NAFTA by selling goods to each other, but more significantly by producing together for both buyers in North America and for third markets. It is noteworthy that the North America very effectively integrated value-added chain in manufacturing, in automotive, electric, electronic, and aerospace. The Lear 85 is now to be launched, but is manufactured in Canada, in Quebec, in Kansas, and in Querétaro, Mexico. And there is not such a thing as an American car, a Canadian car, or a Mexican car if you look close enough. So where we are now, although NAFTA has clearly been a success, we cannot keep standing still. The world economy has changed radically in the last 2 decades. Services loom much larger now, as does e-commerce. And advanced manufacturing, including 3D printing, means that a highly skilled workforce, streamlined regulations, and a vastly improved infrastructure, particularly at the border, will be critically important to take full advantage of our economic complementarity. The energy landscape has also changed radically. We were gifted and we won the lottery, as my Canadian colleague was saying. During the NAFTA negotiations, Mexico did not open its hydrocarbon sectors. But just a month ago, President Peña Nieto signed into law a far-reaching constitutional change that will allow private investment in hydrocarbons. In addition, in its energy outlook for 2040, ExxonMobil estimated that by 2020, North America will become a net natural gas exporter and an exporter of oil around 2030. North America has all the necessary energy resources to fuel its economic growth for a long time, and reliable and affordable energy will be a key component in ensuring a very competitive North American manufacturing base. A good friend and a former U.S. Assistant Secretary of Commerce said not long ago that Mexico and the United States have a 21st century trade with a 20th century legal framework on top of a 19th century border infrastructure. Perhaps the same could be said of the whole NAFTA region. Thus, while NAFTA has been a success, many challenges remain. In 3 weeks' time, Mexico will host President Obama and Prime Minister Harper at the North American Leaders Summit in Toluca. It will be an auspicious occasion to bring new momentum to a North American economic integration where we think and act regionally and not just nationally. It is a very good sign that our governments understand that we must continue to build on the foundations that we laid some 20 years ago. It is also an acknowledgement that our economies are not in the zero-sum game with each other, but rather are competing together as one unit in the global marketplace. We have all seen products that may say made in Mexico or made in Canada, made in the USA, but those distinctions are often deciding these days. More and more, these products are actually just made in North America. And this is something that we should embrace. Embracing it means streamlining customs procedures to reduce border wait times, investing in infrastructure, and education, and recognizing that the unique ways in which our countries complement one another provide our trade bloc with competitive advantages that can pay dividends in the coming decades. If we make the right moves, the future will be made in North America, and everyone will be buying. Just as we planted a tree 20 years ago, we are planting another tree right now. The economic powerhouse of the world, looking forward, is not in Asia, it's here, it's us, it's North America. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We appreciate the ambassadors giving us the perspective on how this has been a wonderful deal for all three countries combined and how there are future opportunities to make it even a stronger relationship. I want to, before we begin with our panel, acknowledge that we have a number of our board members here from the Economic Club of Minnesota, including Tim, Bill, and myself, but we're also pleased to have Christine Cumming, who is the first vice president at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and she's been a wonderful addition to our board. We appreciate Christine joining us, as well as Mark Olson, who was a member of the Federal Reserve Bank, as well as the chairman of the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, or one of the some range of words like that, and Craig Shaver with the Royal Bank of Canada. So we're appreciative of them being here. I also want to acknowledge our sponsors, in addition to Brookings being a co-sponsor with us. I'm pleased to have the Ronald Reagan International Center, where we're being hosted here today, as well as the Graduate School of Political Management at George Washington University, the school that I lead, and we're pleased to have several of our students here as well. We're pleased to have Royal Bank of Canada as a sponsor, as well as the Financial Services Roundtable, as well as McLarty Associates. So without our sponsors, we would not be here today. Thanks to all of those. Please help thank them for me. Let's give the board and the sponsors a round of applause. Now we have a first-class panel for you to really dive into these issues, and it's a great fortune for us to have the players that were very much involved in it. But to lead it off, I would like to first of all introduce the Bob Zoellick, who has been a speaker to the Economic Club before. He is formerly, as you all know, the head of the World Bank. He was a Deputy Secretary of State for the United States. He was U.S. Trade Rep, and during his time at U.S. Trade Rep, he quintupled the number of relationships that America had free trade agreements with. So he has made great contributions to trade in his own right. He also worked with James Baker as Secretary of Treasury, and as Secretary of State has given a long round of service to America in many capacities, and is currently a chairman of Goldman Sachs International Board of Advisors. Please welcome first to the stage Ambassador Robert Zoellick. Thank you. We next have Carla Hills. Ambassador Carla Hills was the U.S. Trade Rep that represented America in the negotiations of NAFTA in the administration of President George Herbert Walker Bush. But she also served in many other capacities serving our nation. She was Secretary of the Department of Housing and Urban Development in the Ford administration, only the third woman to hold a cabinet post. She also has been involved in many other trade capacities, and now is the Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Hills & Company, which helps companies on trade, risk assessments, and issues abroad. And to give some idea of just how substantive of a woman she is, she's not only on the board of the leading policy institutes here in Washington, Council on Foreign Relations, the Inter-American Dialogue, and the Center for Strategic International Studies, but she must have her pick of corporate boards, being on the blue chips of J.P. Morgan, Chase, Rolls-Royce, and Coca-Cola. So please welcome Ambassador Carla Hills as our next participant. We're also pleased to have Mack McLarty, who was at the time the Chief of Staff for President William Jefferson Clinton. And he not only helped to get NAFTA done, but he was also instrumental in many other things. If you remember the last big, huge deficit reduction plan, he also led that and also was there as Chief of Staff during the time of our welfare reform. I could go on with many other accomplishments that he's did and contributions that he's made to our great nation. He also, though, is a businessman, a fourth-generation family transportation business he leads, as well as I mentioned earlier, he was the chairman and chief executive officer of ARCLA, which is a large natural gas company, including with operations in Minnesota. And today he heads McLarty Associates that helps advise countries with issues around the world. Interestingly, he has received the highest civilian honors from Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Mexico, Nicaragua, Panama, and Venezuela. Please welcome Mack McLarty to the stage. We also have both of our partner nations represented here. We're pleased to have Honorable John Weeks, who is currently a senior business advisor for the Canadian law firm of Bennett Jones, but was the chief negotiator for Canada for the North American Free Trade Agreement. He was also Canada's ambassador to the World Trade Organization and served as the chair of the WTO's top body, the General Council. Before that, he was involved in negotiations with the World Trade Organization's predecessor, GATT. So please welcome the Honorable John Weeks from Canada. And no panel on NAFTA would be complete without a representative from Mexico. And let me say that we've had a phenomenal relationship with the nation of Mexico, with the Economic Club of Minnesota, also having Ambassador Sarachan as our speaker. And I know he's going to be here at some point if he's not here now, as well as Agustin Carstens, the head of the Bank of Mexico. We appreciate all the good work Antonio has done in helping us connect tighter and with the Consul General in Mexico. But representing Mexico, we have Dr. Luis de la Calle, who is the founding partner now of De la Calle Mandraza Macera, a consulting firm specializing in the economy. But at the time, he was Undersecretary of International Business Negotiations at the Ministry of Economy. He participated actively in the design, promotion, and implementation of the North American Free Trade Agreement. He is undergrad from ITAM, a very distinguished school in Mexico, and his master's and doctor's here in America at the University of Virginia. Please welcome Dr. Luis de la Calle. So I will turn it over to Ambassador Zoellick to give his opening statements. The others will then give their opening statements, and then Ambassador Zoellick will lead a panel discussion. So thanks to our panel. Give them one more round of applause.
Well, thank you very much, Mark. And it's a distinct privilege to be here and participate in this recognition of Bill Frenzel and the NAFTA Accord that he helped make into a reality. I can see Bill brought a little bit of that brisk Minnesota weather here for us. But I also want to thank all of you, and particularly the Economic Club of Minnesota with Mark and Tim. I had an opportunity, as Mark mentioned, to come up to the Economic Club of Minnesota, and I was just struck by the strength of community there. People from business, academia, civil society groups. I was then able to invite my former colleague Pascal Lamy to come up, and I know he very much enjoyed it. And actually, I'll have a chance to be at an event with the Hubert Humphrey School there in April that the National Endowment of Democracy is sponsoring. So for all the Minnesotans here, I want to just compliment you. It's a really wonderful example of how a community is cohesive, but also supports the international agenda for the United States. And I want to thank the other sponsors, and it's a particular delight to be here with various colleagues. You've heard this from Mark, but I do want to have a particular chance to recognize Carla, who is not only the negotiator, but really the leader and the driver. All of you know her energy. Without that, this would not have happened. And similarly, Mack McLarty. I was the Deputy Chief of Staff of the White House during the transition. I first had a chance to see Mack in late 92, early 93. And if he and President Clinton hadn't taken this forward, we wouldn't be here today. And that's a fantastic commitment to the nature of a democratic transition and the commitment across parties and times to trade. John, we're very fortunate. I was just up in Canada a few weeks ago, and he not only was the chief negotiator and one of the great Canadian experts on GATT and the WTO, but I think he can give us an important perspective looking forward on the trade agenda. And Luis as well. Luis is somebody who, whenever I have a chance to talk to, I always value enormously, not only because of his experience, but he's always on the cutting edge of these issues going forward. I wanted to try to open with 4 thoughts. First, I've always believed that NAFTA was much more than a trade agreement. It was an opportunity, and remains an opportunity, to achieve an historic reconciliation with our continental neighbors and provide the foundation for a future partnership. NAFTA was born as the Cold War was ending. The U.S. needed to create a new international architecture with a greater recognition of the economic dimensions of our foreign policy. On our home continent, the old Mexican one-party corporate state was breaking down. And NAFTA was an opportunity to support Mexico's development, its democratization, and its open society. NAFTA was an opportunity for a stronger North American base in a changing global economy, a foundation for other generations to build upon. Second, I firmly believe there's an opportunity today for a deeper North American compact. And here's my vision. 3 democracies, 500 million people, with energy self-sufficiency and even the opportunity for exports, an integrated infrastructure system, complementary manufacturing and service industries, a shared effort to develop human capital through educational innovation linked to workforce skills and a pro-growth immigration policy, and, over time, a common outlook on our fundamental security and foreign policy interests. That North America would certainly be well positioned to contend with 1.3 billion Chinese or other regions of growth around the world. This year, General David Petraeus and I are co-chairing a Council on Foreign Relations task force that's examining this exact issue. And although this is, I think, the last day of January, I've already had a chance to visit Canada and Mexico with General Petraeus to try to get a sense from the Canadians and Mexicans about their view of this issue, and we had a chance to talk with John and Luis. I will have to say it was a little nicer climate in Mexico City than it was in Ottawa the first week in January. Third, to achieve this North American vision, the U.S. must lead with the sensitivities, attention to the sensitivities of Canada and Mexico. And frankly, I have to suggest that the handling of the XL pipeline is not the way to treat an ally and partner. But it's also so frustrating because it's strategically harmful to this vision of fostering a deeper economic integration with our energy infrastructure. Similarly, as the United States proceeds with the TPP negotiation, I think it would be advisable to have the 3 North American countries to be considering the implications of a stronger North America in an Asia-Pacific region. And similarly, I believe that Canada and Mexico should be cooperating with the United States on the transatlantic negotiations, the TTIP negotiations. You've heard a little bit references to the auto industry. The TTIP negotiations are fundamentally going to be focusing on regulatory and standards issues. How can you deal with a subject like the auto industry without taking account of the fact that the autos in the United States are going to be dependent on parts from Canada, assembly in Mexico? It's an integrated industry, and while each country, of course, has to handle their own negotiations, they certainly should be working together to understand the integrated effects. Finally, to lead, the United States needs leaders. Bill has been a model leader in a representative democracy and for free trade. He blends the complementary perspectives of Minnesota, America, and the world Bill understands business and workers and farmers and politics and families, and he has that very practical horse sense, which always made him a very effective legislator, even when he left Congress. He's a man who brings people together, gets things done, and sets up the next accomplishment. I certainly saw his influence and contributions extend far beyond his specific deeds, because as a very important dimension, Bill has been a counselor and a mentor to me, but also, more importantly, to a subsequent generation of members of Congress of both parties, people now at the top leadership ranks. Bill has been their role model, and we could do no better. Bill's example of leadership has never been more valuable than it is today. President Obama has articulated a very expansive trade agenda. This agenda could be a very important dimension of U.S. international leadership in this decade and the decades to come. He'll need the support of Republicans in Congress. He needs the support of his own party, the Democrats in Congress. He needs to make the case. He needs to stand up to opponents. He needs to push for votes. He needs to build momentum. He needs some of that Frenzel magic. Thank you. So I think, sorry.
Well, it's a great honor for me to be able to participate in the Minnesota Economic Program that honors Bill Frenzel, and I compliment Congressman Kennedy and Penny for their leadership in putting this together. Making Bill Frenzel the champion of free trade is a natural. During his 20 years as the ranking minority primary spokesman on trade, he made a difference. And he certainly made my job a whole lot easier. No one was better to go to for advice and actually consolation from time to time. You know, he was for 15 years the congressional representative to Geneva on trade. And I can say that President Clinton and Mack McLarty here so wisely selected him as the president's advisor on the NAFTA. And he was a major force in making this agreement come into play. So it's appropriate, I think, that we take the 20th anniversary of the North American Free Trade Agreement as a platform for honoring this man who's made such a difference. As has already been pointed out, the economies of our three nations have soared as a result of our integration. Interregional trade is up more than 400% since 1994, and as the Canadian ambassador pointed out, Canada is our first largest single customer, and Mexico, as the Mexican ambassador pointed out, is right behind as our second largest customers. But more importantly, our economies are very tightly integrated. $2 billion worth of goods and services pass our northern border every single day, and $1 billion worth of goods and services pass our southern border every single day. And it has been pointed out that 40 cents of every dollar that comes into our country from Mexico is U.S. input, and 25 cents of every dollar that crosses our border is U.S. input. Now, the North American Free Trade Agreement has had its share of critics. You've been reminded of Ross Perot's sucking sound. Most of the criticism focuses on Mexico, focuses on jobs. And I'll point out that in the past several months, Yale University and the Fed have done a report on job creation as a result of the NAFTA, and have found that there was job creation in all three economies that can be attributed to the NAFTA. All of our entrepreneurs in the United States, large and small, benefited from the 116 million consumers and the $1 trillion economy. But small and medium-sized businesses in particular benefited because more than half their exports go to Mexico. And because of the proximity and now the openness of the market. And small and medium-sized businesses create more than half of all jobs in the United States. I would say that the NAFTA has made the North American region one of the most competitive in the world. But I would also have to say the rest of the world, it has not stood still. In the last 10 years, there has been a proliferation of bilateral and plurilateral agreements where the United States is not a party. And we could make a difference by building on the platform of what NAFTA created. And let me give you just 4 quick thoughts. One is the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We've got a dozen countries, a large economy, Korea knocking at the door. We should be standing together and talking about not only how we open the markets individually, but how we can collaborate and create more opportunity as a region. Secondly, the Pacific Alliance. Mexico has moved forward with 3 other countries with whom it has a free trade agreement, Colombia, Chile, and Peru. Costa Rica, with which it also has a free trade agreement, has just joined the Pacific Alliance. The notion is to move step by step in opening the market. You may recall there was great excitement about having a free trade agreement for all of the Western Hemisphere as we finished the NAFTA negotiation. It didn't come to pass. It was to occur in 2005. We could move forward on that. We are now an observer to the Pacific Alliance, as is Canada. We have a free trade agreement with all of the participants, as does Canada. And we should be working together to ensure that we don't take a position that would erode the integration and the opportunity that we have moving forward. And most important is the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, so-called TTIP. This is, as has been pointed out, a regulatory effort. Our average tariffs is only 3% with Europe, with the exception of a few very high tariffs on autos, apparel, and fabric. And the problems lie in regulation. Regulation, like on autos, we have different rules that govern lights, seat belts, position of mirrors, a host of things. And no one would suggest that the cars that we drive in England are any less safe than the cars we drive in Minnesota. And if we could, if not harmonize, at least give equal credibility, that is, credence to our differences, it would save a whole lot of time. It is a fact that we do chemical analysis in the United States on drugs and other products. We do exactly the same analysis across the Atlantic. Why don't we share our tests? Why should entrepreneurs have to do it twice? So there's a lot that could come from this. But we need Canada and Mexico at our side. Canada has a free trade agreement with Europe that it completed in October. Mexico has had ones since 2000. And our regulations simply have to be made consistent. And lastly, I would say, and here's where I would speak to Minnesotans and to everyone you know, we need trade promotion authority. We need, and we have had it since 1974, but we need people like the congressmen, like the ambassadors, and like the people who are here today to speak out about why we need it. We have a separation of powers government that lets Congress have control over the money. Our Constitution gives the President the power to negotiate. We won't get a good trade agreement unless we can bring those things together. Why would any country put their tough political issues on the table if they thought that the agreement was going to be amended and perhaps not passed? And so we need to talk to universities, to think tanks, to the public, write op-eds. Bob has just written a very good op-ed, and we need to explain why it is that Trade Promotion Authority, sometimes called fast track, is an absolute essential. With those four things, if we were to move forward, North America would be premier, the economic region of the world. So I thank you for inviting me to join you today.
Good morning. I am delighted and indeed feel privileged to be here. Congressman Kennedy, thank you for organizing this event, for your leadership. It's been a pleasure to work with you. And Tim Penny, it's a great reunion to be with you. Some of the kind things that Mark said about our efforts in the Clinton administration would not have come to pass without your leadership. And indeed, I feel a reunion, a return home here to Minnesota, where I visited regularly once a month when our company had the privilege, Bill, to be involved with Madagascar. And all of this cold weather that Ambassador Zoellick talked about, we just kind of like that in the natural gas business with those meters spinning. In fact, I called our president of Madagascar. Both our president and chief financial officer, both were named Peterson, apt of Minnesota. And I said, boy, it's 20 degrees up there. That must be a great day. He said, oh, Mac, it's just a wimpy winter day up here. 20 degrees, it's not cold at all. It's a particular honor to be with Bill Frenzel, who Bob Zoellick captured in his comments, as did Carla. And I'll have more to say about Bill later on at the luncheon today, so I'll be brief in my references to him today. Ambassador Medina, Mora, it's great to be with you as always. You represent your country in such a distinguished and thoughtful manner, as does your counterpart, Ambassador Doer, who is pretty intent, I think, on evening the score with Senator Klobuchar when they next get together. But that's in the spirit of friendship and partnership. And it's, of course, a great privilege to be a part of such a distinguished panel with Luis and John and, of course, with Carla and Bob. I feel very, very pleased to be a part of this occasion. The NAFTA, I think the points I would make are a couple of fold. First of all, I would say it was a pretty thin and narrow path for us to be here at this 20-year celebration. As Business Week once wrote about a month before the vote, maybe 6 weeks, NAFTA is not completely out, but it's certainly down. It was an uphill traverse for sure. And it really began on a ride that I had with President Clinton, Bob, in from Andrews one day. And I said, Mr. President, are we ready to move forward with the NAFTA? And he turned around, and I see Congressman Bacchus there in an uncharacteristic way. President Clinton had a little sharpness in his voice, which was not usually the case in our conversations. And he said, Mac, I've told you 3 times I am ready to move forward with the NAFTA. And I said, Mr. President, that's good. I'm glad to get that confirmation. The reason I ask, not everyone in our administration has quite that same feeling about moving forward. And so many of you who've been involved in government and the legislative branch and so forth know that there's a sequencing issue of what legislation are you going to present and when are you going to do it. Obviously, our first challenge was our economic plan, and then from there, the agenda became pretty crowded. So it took, one, a basic decision to move forward. And I must say that a lot of our Republican friends thought we were late in getting started, and they had a point in that. I remember going to the Wednesday meeting, Mark, and it was not a kinder and gentler time at that Republican gathering of moderate Republicans. I still, Bill, remember that vividly. But once we got started, I think we did marshal good bipartisan support. So the first point I would like to make is a trade agreement of this type, a major agreement, takes sustained leadership, consistent leadership from one administration to another. It makes a difference. Ambassador Hills, President Bush, Bob Zoellick, they negotiated this agreement. They had it in place, but it was our responsibility then to pass it. Without that kind of continuity of leadership, the North American Free Trade Agreement would not have become a reality. Secondly, it clearly was going to take a bipartisan effort to achieve this measure, not only in terms of the votes, as Bill Frenzel well understood, but also any kind of major piece of legislation is so much better received in our country, so much better in every way, if you can do it on a bipartisan basis. I remember very well when we first started, we finally had Newt Gingrich come to the Roosevelt Room and was counting votes in the Congress with George Stephanopoulos. That only happened one time to my memory, but it was a good time when it happened. So my second point is it had to be done on a bipartisan basis. Now, from a Mexico standpoint, this was a bold and visionary, as Luis and his colleagues knew so well at the time, move. It was a difficult decision. Carla, I remember calling Jaime Serra. You had negotiated just about a complete agreement with Secretary Zoellick, but there were a few issues still open. And of course, Bill, you and Jim know that members of Congress have a few issues like peanuts and so forth that you have to make sure that everything is well in order. And I talked to Jaime, and I said, Jaime, I know we're asking you to go the extra mile. He said, oh, no, my friend. You're asking us to go the extra mile on some of these issues. And indeed, we were. But I think Bob had it just right. The North American Free Trade Agreement, from a Mexico standpoint, as important as it was to commerce, trade, investment, in my judgment, without overstating, it was a fundamental pillar in Mexico's continuing to look outward, to develop their country, to step on the world stage, to strengthen their institutions going forward. And I think we see that now, as Eduardo and I have visited about, in a strong middle class developing in Mexico, strong central bank in Mexico. Still certainly work to be done, challenges ahead in our country as well, and even for our Canadian friends, but you seem to have avoided many of the pitfalls that we did in the economic downturn, and that's commendable. But I think the NAFTA really was a fundamental pillar of stability in pushing off, allowing Mexico to push off to move forward. And from a U.S.-Canada standpoint, and of course from the Minnesota Economic Club and all Minnesotans, Canada obviously is a relationship that is a personal one, an important one, and a meaningful one. But it clearly deepened the partnership, but it was not without some peril as well early on, because Prime Minister Chrétien, John, as you'll recall, had not particularly embraced the NAFTA when he ran for Prime Minister. So my first call was to John Peltier, who was Chief of Staff to Prime Minister Chrétien. I said, John, we have not met, but we must talk. And I think, Tim, early on, had we not had Prime Minister Chrétien, we were able to make some adjustments to accommodate some of the concerns that he had expressed, but we had a very thin and narrow window there. Had we not been able to move forward with Canada at that time in the Congress, I'm not sure we would have quite topped the hill to victory as it turned out. So all of the parties had to be aligned here to get this important agreement done. Johnny Apple of the New York Times, very respected journalist, wrote that President Clinton expended his political capital and thought this in some ways was the most significant achievement of his first year. And indeed, we got over 100 Democratic votes and 132 votes, I think 131 Bill Frenzel personally delivered, Republican votes, and we passed the agreement. But I think the most important part of this program, of the Minnesota Economic Club, and Mark, that you and your colleagues have organized today, is not just the past, although there's much to be proud of there, there's much to learn from it, but it's really the present and the future. That's really the focus, I think, of our discussions today, and obviously Ambassador Zoellick and Ambassador Hills have already been articulate, thoughtful, purposeful in their comments about that. I mean, we have a moment here pretty clearly to really seize the opportunities before us in a major way regarding trade with two large trade agreements. But more broadly, with so much talk about an interconnected world, the need to renew and strengthen our three respective economies, but certainly in the United States in terms of good jobs and good paying jobs, all of the discussion that we'll hear tonight in the State of the Union and the follow-up. We have a true moment in time for the North American Partnership Platform, unity, work together to become not only a real engine of growth for our respective countries, but a real stability and anchor in a good way for the world at a pivotal time. So that's really, I think, the lessons of the NAFTA for the present moment. And someone who spent 10 years in the energy business before taking partial leave of my senses and coming to Washington, the energy transformation is real, and it's a vital part of all of this. So we have an opportunity. It's ours to seize. I look forward to discussing that more as the day progresses. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Congressman Kennedy and Congressman Frenzel. It's an honor to be here today. If I went on to acknowledge all the other sponsors, I think I'd use up my whole 5 minutes. So it's good to see so many people wanting to be associated with this anniversary. And I think the title that you've chosen for this event today is very good, commemorating the achievement of NAFTA, but also looking forward to the future of free trade. And I think we've already heard some very good presentations that are really quite inspiring in terms of how to try to breathe some life into that approach. Looking back, listening to Mack just now, is about his call to Jean Pelletier when Jean Chrétien became Prime Minister, reminded me that during my time as Canada's chief negotiator for the NAFTA, I actually served 3 different governments. The government of Brian Mulroney, his conservative successor, Kim Campbell, and then Jean Chrétien. So there was a little bit of drama, I think, in all the NAFTA countries as we tried to bring this very important agreement home. And as you were talking about bipartisanship in the United States, one of the things that went through my mind is, and you were saying, Republicans thought you were a little late in moving, and well, maybe some people in your party thought you were either early or shouldn't have moved at all. But I remembered that one of the things we agreed on very early on, and when President Clinton came into office, when we embarked on the side agreement negotiations, is that we would keep the date for implementing NAFTA that had been agreed in the original agreement of January 1, 1994. And we did that. It was a bit of a close run thing, but we did it.
We did.
I think, we've heard a lot about the importance of NAFTA, the value of NAFTA, the success of it. Clearly, the economic effects have been large and positive. It's helped restructure the North American economy, notably through the supply chains that people have already referred to here this morning. And yet, despite all these successes, there's been, in a lot of political circles, a sort of angst about talking about NAFTA, using the word NAFTA. And frankly, this despite the fact that public opinion surveys show that a large majority of North Americans, including 65% of Americans, think that free trade among the three North American countries is a good thing. Now, they didn't use the word NAFTA in that poll. Maybe that's part of the problem. But I think, frankly, that this fear of talking about NAFTA in some quarters is actually impeding the planning of how we carry forward this project that's so important to the three North American countries. If you look at the Trans-Pacific Partnership, I'm going to concentrate on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, although I could equally talk about Canada's agreement with the EU and Mexico's and the TTIP, but I'm just going to focus on the one in my initial comments because I think it's easier to concentrate on that and maybe go into some things in just a little bit more depth than I might otherwise do. The TPP represents the first time in 20 years that the three North American countries are actually sitting down, negotiating with each other at the same negotiating table. And it seems to me that this is an opportunity to look at how do we carry forward and do things in this context that are going to improve our competitiveness, improve our prosperity as three partners in the global marketplace. And so you'd think there's an enormous opportunity here. We should be talking and working with each other and looking at how we do this. And yet it's not at all clear to me that we're really doing that in any concerted fashion or in real depth. And I think that's a mistake. And moreover, even more seriously, I'm not sure that we're thinking about how are these other negotiations going to impact on what we've done in NAFTA. And just thinking about NAFTA and TPP, here we've got in the TPP an agenda that's very similar to the agenda of the NAFTA, a bit broader, and it's going to result in an agreement that's going to have provisions in it on all the same issues that are covered in the NAFTA. Now, some of those provisions may be the same, some of them may be different, some of them may even be conflicting. And are we sitting down and thinking about how we're going to work these things out? And, there are a number, so people say, that's one thing to talk in generality, but what are some of those areas where that could happen, where it could create perhaps problems for the competitiveness of our North American platform in the global marketplace? And I think, one is in the form of the market access negotiations. Are we going to have results coming out of TPP that are essentially bilateral results? Or is it going to be put together as one cohesive market access package at the end? On government procurement, I think we can see, differences, benefits that Canada, for instance, is now giving or will be giving when our agreement with Europe is implemented to the European Union that we don't give to the United States. How do we look at making sure that we offer through negotiation to our partners in the North American marketplace the same opportunities we're giving to others? Rules of origin, we've talked about the automobile issue. Certainly Canadian negotiators negotiating with the European Union realized quite quickly there was no such thing as a Canadian car. And this, of course, is a problem in terms of how do you try to get some access to Europe. So we had to work out special exemptions from what would be the normal rules of origin. All the regulatory issues, ranging from those in the agricultural area like carcass washes to those that have already been mentioned in the automobile industry. All of these things, we have to make sure that what we're doing in these other agreements isn't going to disrupt the supply chains that are so important now to our North American economy and that resulted from the NAFTA, but which many politicians are afraid to acknowledge really exist. The emergency action against imports. We've got some special provisions in the NAFTA, which I could go in at some length to describe, but I won't right now. But I don't know whether anybody's really thinking about how is that going to relate to the provisions that will be in the TPP on these same matters. Dispute settlement systems. There might be some opportunities here to improve how dispute settlement works in regional agreements, but there may also be some problems that will result if certain things that are in the North American agreement context aren't carried forward into the global context. And environment. I've been reading, courtesy of WikiLeaks, how about the negotiations in the on the environment chapter in the North American, I mean in the TPP, and the disagreements there between the United States and some of its partners. And apparently Canada's been the chair of some of this negotiating group. And I think you know, those are very important issues that have to be thought through very carefully. And certainly they were heated issues that we went through when we were doing the side agreement negotiations as well, and the NAFTA. And all of this, I believe, really requires a recognition politically that our relationship is important, that it requires special attention, even when we're negotiating in a context like with Europe or with our Trans-Pacific partners. And if we don't do that, we risk having things happen that aren't going to be good. And there are a number of examples of where, even in the current situation, without creating new agreements, neglecting our North American partnership and the benefits that have come from NAFTA has led us into trouble. And we've heard one already this morning. Let me give another, which is, you know, the country of origin labeling regulations in the United States. I mean, country of origin labeling regulations may be a good thing. You know, I think a lot of Canadians would probably think they're a good thing. But let's design them in a way that they don't disrupt trade. And the result of the way the country of origin regulations on beef and pork are now working in the United States is resulting in the dismantling of the North American market for meat and livestock that was actually fostered by our original FTA and by NAFTA. This doesn't make any sense. And yet this is the sort of thing that happens when we stop sort of thinking about our partnership and kind of go on autopilot and look at individual issues on their own rather than in a larger context. So I think basically this is a moment we should be seizing to use the TPP and other negotiations to strengthen the economic prosperity and competitiveness of North America in the global environment. Thank you.
Luis?
Thank you, Mr. Kennedy, Congressman Kennedy, Congressman Frankel, for the invitation. It's an honor to be here with you and share some views on the NAFTA. It's been 20 years already. People talk about NAFTA convergence. Canada and Minnesota are minus 20. Washington, D.C. is 20 degrees, and Mexico City is 20 degrees Celsius. You know, 20 years ago, we had a window of opportunity that came from the fall of the Berlin Wall, as Bob Zoellick mentioned, and a significant leadership in the three countries. Many people advised Mexico not 20 years ago, but 23 years ago when we began their NAFTA process, not to do it. Most people say it will never happen. You will never convince the U.S. Congress to have a vote on Mexico that is favorable in terms of integration. But we didn't take no for an answer. I was in Mexico City a few weeks ago, and I was told that we couldn't use NAFTA as a word in Washington because it's a bad word. If we took that advice back then, we wouldn't be here. And if we take this advice now, nothing will happen. I mean, I think we have to raise the level of ambition. And NAFTA was made possible because of the geopolitical circumstances back then, but mostly because there were people committed to this process in the US, Mexico, and Canada. In the US, Mexico was fortunate to have a cabinet full of Texans back then, with the vision thing, President Bush and Secretary Baker, Secretary Mosbacher. We were very lucky to have, of course, Carla Hills as our counterpart in the US, and Michael Wilson, John Wicks, and Jules Katz. They made an enormous contribution to Mexico by being demanding in terms of the disciplines that we should adopt. And it was difficult for Mexico to take some of those disciplines. And this was the first time a developing country was negotiating with developed countries such high level of disciplines. And the virtue of the NAFTA is, it's ambition, and two, that we adopted the same disciplines There is no difference between the disciplines that apply to Mexico and those that apply to the US and Canada. I mean, because Mexico was making a huge bet back then that we wanted to have the rule of law. And the NAFTA is the first seeds, the planting of the tree, as Ambassador Medina Mora was saying, for Mexico to become a country based on rules. And the NAFTA is basically, the architecture of the NAFTA is based on rules that apply generally, on services, on investment, on goods, across the board, with relatively simple rules. And it was, in that sense, revolutionary. Because the NAFTA is a symmetric agreement, maybe with asymmetric transition periods, with the same level of disciplines for all of the countries involved. We are also very lucky to have had in the US Congress significant leadership. Bill Frenzel in the Ways and Means Committee, but also Dan Rostankowski, Sam Gibbons, Bob Packwood, and of course Lloyd Benson in the Finance Committee, who was from almost Mexican because he was from the Valley in Texas. And then Mexico was also very lucky to have, when Bill Clinton won the campaign, to make sure that this was a bipartisan effort in Washington, and the efforts of Mack McLarty were very crucial in making that happen. The NAFTA was conceived 20 years ago as an agreement to increase trade and investment among Canada, Mexico, and the US, and has been tremendously successful. And if you look at the economic studies made back then, forecasting the flows of trade between the three countries, all of the forecasts, people arguing for or against NAFTA, have been surpassed by reality. We trade much more than we thought was possible back then. But the agreement was conceived to increase trade among ourselves, and now we need to change priorities. We need to see how we structure our trade relationship in such a way that we conquer the world, so that we stop talking about, or we don't only talk about whether imports coming from Mexico have US content or Canadian content, but whether our exports to Asia are North American. Last year, Mexico exported to China $1 billion worth of cars. 3 years ago, it was 0. So the rate of growth is just enormous. I mean, you might say $1 billion is not much. Well, those cars exported from Mexico, from Silao and Hermosillo, are Canadian, US, and Mexican. And that is the way that we should actually think about how we participate in TPP, in TTIP, and in other trade negotiations, including the Pacific Alliance that Carla Hills mentioned. NAFTA continues to be a state of the art. If the only issue in TPP is whether it's going to be NAFTA minus or NAFTA plus. But I mean, it's not enough. We now have to go beyond the NAFTA and complement the NAFTA with something more ambitious, to make the integration more fruitful and to make the region more competitive. And I think that I have some ideas that I'd like to share with you on areas where I think we should be working to make the NAFTA more fruitful for our countries. The first would be education. I mean, Mexico, we have the students. In Canada and the US, you have the teachers and the classrooms. Well, it lends itself for a good trading possibility. I think we also need an agreement to have a basic research laboratory in Mexico that will be funded by Mexico, US, and Canada. Why not? I think we need to also think about how to integrate healthcare. I mean, Mexico has the ability to train doctors, nurses. Mexico could be providing North America with 1 million nurses in the next 10 years. 1 million nurses is half of the workers we have in the maquiladora industry. I think we also have to do a little work on transportation. If we don't have excellence in logistics, we'll never be a platform to export to the world. And moving on transportation means that we need to be more ambitious on ground transportation, trucking, rail, more border crossings, more integration of the transportation systems, maritime, and air transportation. And we should do these things trilaterally, if possible. bilaterally if needed, or unilaterally if we cannot convince either Canada or the US to do it. We need, of course, to transform also the border crossing. We need to convince the authorities that the more trade we have, the more security we'll get. And that obstacles to trade are the source of insecurity, not the source of security. I think that we need to revisit how to make the border crossing more simple and more effective, and how to invest on infrastructure to have more lanes, more hours, etc. We need also to move on energy. Now that Mexico has made significant reforms to its constitution on energy market, we need to have an integrated energy market in North America. In Mexico, we talk about the energy sector, not the energy market, and now that we have liberalized our system, we need to make sure that we become part of the North American energy market. Because cheap energy will be one of the main sources of competitiveness of North America, and it's crucial for Mexico to participate in that revolution taking place right now. We also need to move on removing the tyranny of small differences on regulatory matters. And maybe to not wait for the TTIP negotiations to take place. There is no reason for the European Union and the US to negotiate something unless it's very ambitious. It's an already open economy as well. The level of ambition will depend on regulatory issues. And I think Canada and Mexico should insist that we participate in those negotiations and that we trilaterally move on regulatory issues before the US negotiates those with the European Union. On TTIP, on TPP, we need to make sure, as John Wakes was saying, that the disciplines of the NAFTA coexist with TPP, and that it's clear in the agreement. I mean, the NAFTA has disciplines that are beyond what will happen in TPP, and those disciplines need to remain in place in the NAFTA process. I'll finish by saying the following. 20 years ago, Mexico made a huge investment in stability. The rule of law paid off. Our exports multiplied ×7. We need to use that instrument, which is stability, for the rest of the economy and the rest of Mexico's daily lives. To apply the same certainty that the NAFTA has given to the rest of daily activities in Mexico going forward. But we didn't stop doing NAFTA. But NAFTA helped Mexico becoming a stable country in terms of its macroeconomic policy, an independent central bank, to have a sound financial system. Canada and Mexico did not suffer the Lehman Brothers crisis for that reason, and to have sound public finances. 0 budget deficits for 17 years in a row. And that stability that Mexico invested is what has made Mexico a different country today. And the NAFTA is not the only explanation as to why that happened, but it certainly made a big contribution to make Mexico a more stable country. Difficult thing to say. It's like wearing a suit that doesn't quite fit Mexicans, seeing Mexico a stable country, but stability will become our main comparative advantage in due time. Thank you very much.